And then let's meet the last speaker in this first panel. He is Michael Carbone, and on Twitter he is WonderMFC. And he is the manager of the tech policy and programs at Access, and he analyzes digital attacks on civil society organizations, supports the development of innovative secure communications technologies, and provides preventative advice to civil society organizations and human rights defenders to stay digitally secure. Please join me in welcoming Michael.
Hey everyone, thanks Tanya for having me here. I just pushed a button.
It's okay. You just push it again. Here we go.
Awesome. All right, so as Tanya and Reagan briefly mentioned, I work on the interaction of technology and policy at Access, the International Human Rights Organization that Reagan briefly talked about. I also focus on digital security for people and communities in high-risk environments. Obviously, with the Snowden revelations, we know that we are all at risk. But for some communities, that risk also turns into both physical security concerns and obviously impacts on rights. And that's something that we face here in the US, but also abroad. Today, I'm just going to keep it pretty short so we can focus on the panel, but I'm going to talk about this interaction between technology and policy and the issues of power and trust and some things that we can do about it. So as the previous panelists noted, technology is trumping policy in terms of the access it enables governments to have to our information, to our communications, to our lives. As Snowden noted at the very beginning of the revelations, an NSA analyst sitting at his desk technically has the capacity to view and all of that collected communications and metadata. The only limit, the only barrier is internal policies within the NSA that prevents that access to those communications. And what are those internal policies? Well, it's honestly internal implementations of secret interpretations of existing laws, right? So we've got this onion of obscurity and obfuscation as to who is ultimately responsible and who is ultimately providing oversight to the implementation of our laws through technology today. And what that means in practice is we have tremendous impact of mass surveillance, both on individuals and communities. Individuals and communities have a variety of methods to combat that surveillance. So I'm going to briefly run through some of them and what that ultimately impacts. So what do you need to do in order to avoid being targeted by mass surveillance? Well, you don't want to say things that you think might get you targeted. And so what does that in practice mean? That means that you're self-censoring what you want to express or the groups or communities that you want to associate with in order to prevent that targeting. And what it ultimately means is that the freedom of expression, the rights that are enjoyed by citizens, is being infringed upon by a government, even if you aren't getting stopped and frisked, you don't have a physical interaction with your government, you still, in practice, end up with a similar relationship that an oppressive government would have. Because in practice, an oppressive government wants the citizenry to have a normalized set of expressions. Dissidents, etc., are not appreciated. So some examples. Jennifer previously mentioned the Ukrainian text messaging of folks that were at a protest site or nearby, and not actually them, but their cell phones. That's a great example of how technology can be used in order to influence citizenry into kind of rethinking, the limits of what's allowed for political expression. And obviously that has tremendously bad impact on that citizenry and the rights that they get to enjoy. And what this means is that's basically eroding the balance of power between the government and the citizenry, right? No longer do the citizens feel free to enjoy those rights that they have and that they have a kind of a safe space, but instead they have to constantly be questioning their actions, their speeches, the people that they interact with, and see whether, and try to critically think, where is that red line? Because ultimately there isn't a red line, it's a gray line, and the government, for a government, that's actually better than a red line, because then they get to do less work. You know, they don't have to be constantly interacting with you to let you know when you've crossed the line. They can let you self-censor yourself. So on the access side, we interact with a lot of at-risk communities, as I mentioned. So I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the issues that surveillance can have, and this is both internationally and then also in the US. So I don't know if you heard, very recently in Uganda, a law was passed criminalizing homosexuality, as well as associated interactions with homosexuals. So one example of that is, as soon as that law was passed, one of the leading newspapers in that country published the top 200 homosexuals in Uganda. Here's their contact information. Here's their photo. You know, like, have at them, basically. And this is information that's not gathered through the content of communications or the content of interactions, but this is metadata. This is who interacts with whom, where, and this is information that the government and government-aligned militias have collected. And so that's a very real example of where digital surveillance ends up having real physical impacts on communities that are at risk. In the US, we've interacted with lawyers working with high-risk individuals and communities. For instance, one client is a former CIA rendition victim who's obviously continuing to be targeted for surveillance. And the issue is the attorneys feel powerless to have any type of secure communications channel. What they do is, at the beginning of every call that they have with this victim, they say, for the purposes of FBI or NSA surveillance, this is a privileged communication between attorney and client. That's the limit that they can do. They can then hope that there's some type of internal policy in the FBI or NSA that says, this is privileged communication, let's not look at that. But we know from the Snowden revelations that that's insufficient, that is still used for foreign intelligence purposes. There's also, obviously there are many other examples of this type of impact that surveillance has on marginalized communities at high-risk individuals. So what does this do? This has eroded the trust, the confidence that we have in government, as I mentioned, this balance of power. But it also erodes the trust that we have in companies and organizations, in the brands and tools and services that we use today. As we've seen, the NSA and other large adversaries don't actually need the compliance of these companies in order to support their surveillance. So yes, they'll ask for the front door key to Google, Facebook, Dropbox, etc. But as we've seen, they've also will hack into the data centers of those same companies in order to ensure that if they aren't invited through the front door, they'll always have the back door. And what this means in practice is that the corporate surveillance that we've seen and that the previous panels have briefly talked about is now being piggybacked by state surveillance. For instance, in one of the revelations, the NSA was using Google cookies in order to track targeted individuals. Also, browser fingerprinting and other measures that corporations often try to use in order to track your browsing and spending habits obviously can be used also by state adversaries. So what we can do. So as we can see, this trust that we have in companies, in governments, is not verifiable in the sense that we don't have a clear picture of how they're actually implementing these laws that we have passed, the secret interpretations that they've heard from FISA Court and others. And so what we need is we need to be able to minimize the number of entities that we need to trust in order to ensure that our communications, our data, our communities aren't compromised. So in practice, what this means is instead of self-censoring, or instead of relying on some third party whose implementation of our trust we can't see, we need to be using user-to-user secure communications. So we need to be allowing it such that we are only trusting our end recipient, the person that we intend to communicate with, and that we are only trusting the effectiveness of the tool that we're using. And these tools and services already exist. The beneficial aspect of these tools, how they're verifiable, is that they are free and they are open source. So what this means is that you can see what this tool is on the inside, how it works, and you can verify, in fact, that there is not a backdoor, that there is not a secret relationship between this tool, this service, and the government, or that it's not secretly tracking you, such that the government can piggyback upon that tracking. These are the privacy-enhancing tools that Reagan mentioned. I'll leave the rest of the time for the panel. I look forward to our talks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.